I'm going to spend the day doing what a lot of them want me to do is reviewing. But first of all, I want to go over a couple of words. I mean, I'm looking at page 380 in the book, Renaissance. The term Renaissance has to do with rebirth and reawakening, a revival of learning. And in a lot of cases, it was simply going back to the classics, going back to the writings of Aristotle, Cicero. They were looking backward instead of ahead, which was okay to do. In fact, Petrarch went around collecting all those old manuscripts that had been collecting dust for centuries in the monasteries, and he got the monks to looking up through drawers and through libraries, books that had not been touched in centuries, and figuring out a way to copy them and read them. Today we have electronic means that we can decipher some of what they said, but in those days they didn't. But digging up some of the old writings, thinking that they could rediscover a lot of truth. And this was good because the ancients had a lot of knowledge that needed to be discovered. Now, a lot of emphasis was placed on humanism. And this is a trend that continues to this day. A Greek philosopher said, man is the measure of all things. In other words, that Greek meant we don't need God in our thinking, we just want man. And a lot of the humanists did not go that far, but they leaned in that direction, that we can figure things out for ourselves. And folk, with all fairness, I mean, I think that was great and wonderful. One of the reasons the Western world progressed as far as it did was they had a Renaissance, a rebirth, a reawakening, and interest. And then the Renaissance was followed up by another period of time called the Reformation, which, if you take second semester world history, hopefully your teacher will start off talking about the Reformation. But the Renaissance led to the Reformation, a time of reform. Now, other parts of the world, they had maybe a miniature Renaissance, but not the extent Europeans had. And it's difficult to find a period of time in other parts of the world called a Reformation, where there was a general change in a way of thinking, and this Reformation opened the door to scientific progress. It wasn't just religious. I mean, all right, the Reformation started out as a religious movement, but then it went from there to being a scientific movement, and then the science led to political changes and economic changes, and all this led to Europeans eventually bursting out of their continent and overspreading the whole globe and conquering much of the world. Not that that was always necessarily good, but it ultimately led to inventions like the radio, the television, and then the computer, the internet, all of which had its roots at this time we're talking about, called the Renaissance. Now, some of the one most famous person, two of them, actually, Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Now, some of these men were outstanding in more than one field. In the case of Michelangelo, he was a painter, sculptor, and architect, which today we hardly find a person outstanding more on the field. In the case of Leonardo da Vinci, he was a painter and a scientist. Leonardo da Vinci put together a device that he called an airplane that he believed would fly, and it might have flown had they known about the gasoline engine. The problem that all he had in the way of an engine was a steam engine, but the steam engine is simply too heavy to work on an airplane. Too lossy. I mean, a steam engine, the best steam engines only put out about 10% of the power that's put into them, and the rest is wasted in heat. So his airplane might have flown if they had known about the gasoline engine. The gasoline engine is much lighter and more, well, maybe not more powerful, but much lighter than a steam engine. But the technology of his day did not allow him to perfect his plane and get it off the ground. He worked with possibly a microscope I'm not sure about that, but he dabbled in science as well as painting. His most famous painting, you see a picture of on page 383, The Last Supper. Regrettably, that painting about the Last Supper is an anachronism. We now know that Christ and his disciples, like other Romans, would actually have reclined and lying on their stomach while they ate. And a lot of doctors say this is really the best way to eat. It promotes more efficient stomach work and less problems with your whole digestive system. The Romans and Greeks, again, would put down a cot, lie on their stomach, and eat. The table was about 6 inches off the floor. They would not actually eat off the floor, they eat off the table in a reclining position. So the Last Supper painting, again, represents the 13th and 14th century. There are ideas of what the supper would have looked like. He groups the disciples, the 12 disciples, in groups of 3, 3 here and 3 there, and 3 there and 3 there, and they all 3, he's just simply, he's told them, one of you is going to betray me, and this gets them all in a state of confusion, uproar. Other painters did not know where to put Judas, so he puts Judas between Peter and John, right there in the center, and Judas is clutching the money bag. But he's not interacting with the others. Unlike the others, he's got like a stony silence between him and the other. Now, folks, there is a story going around that when when Leonardo da Vinci first painted, the first person he painted was Jesus. So he looked around and saw an up-and-coming young nobleman. Said, hey, you know, come here and pose for me. The young nobleman posed and said, I'm going to put you in the center of the picture and you'll be the Jesus in the picture. Well, years went by, and last of all, he was going to paint Judas. So he went out to the slums of the city to look for Judas, brought a person in who looked like he'd make a good, unsuccessful person, asked the man's name, and it turned out the man whom he asked was the same man who had posed for Jesus years before. Wow. Michelangelo said, what happened? Leonardo, what happened to you? Well, he said, I fell to drinking, and I went from one bad business venture to another. My wife couldn't stand me, and she left me, and I wound up here in the slums, completely broke. But he remembered having been posed for Jesus many years before. Now he was posing as Judas, even though in the picture, in a painting, the two of them do not look alike. All right. Architectural styles changed. A lot of emphasis was placed on sculpture. In the area of politics, Italy and Germany continued to be largely divided. The power of kings waned somewhat, then revived and went back and forth in cycles. The days of the strong king was still to be in the future. All right, so much for that period. All right, before I proceed, anybody have any questions? Okay. All right. By the way, for the final exam, it begins on December, it begins at 10, like the class does, but we have 2 hours instead of 75 minutes. Now, how many of you think you might want to take a makeup? Okay, anybody? All right. All right. We'll proceed now. Let me tell you something, Ryan. I'm giving another final exam on at 2 o'clock this upcoming Wednesday, at 2:30. 2:30, right here, 2:30. If you want to come in here and take the makeups, you're more than welcome to do that. Simply because I would not want to be in your shoes. Wednesday at 2:30, right here, is my final exam. Same subject, their class. All right. I'm not supposed to do that, folks, but this student has not taken any tests. All right, so much for that. All right, then the rest of you, I guess, will not be taking makeups, at least. All right, review. How many of you remember what I said a few days ago, the difference between Romanesque and Gothic? 2 types of cathedrals, the Romanesque cathedral, the Gothic cathedral.
You got the shapes.
The shapes.
rounded versus spiral?
Yeah, the one of them, okay, say it a little bit louder.
This is the difference because what Roman's more like rounded, and the Gothics more like spire-esque.
Yeah. Let's see, well, to review a little bit. All right. Right here, right here. Okay, I'm going to turn this on. Now, folk, I've arranged the camera in such a way that you folk can see this. Persons who aren't here won't be able to see it. All right. I do believe it's okay to show favoritism to attendees over non-attendees. All right. Here's what I want to do. Okay, that thing is coming on. All right, excellent. Excellent. All right. Now let me see if I can enlarge that a little bit. View. Zoom. Let's see what this does. All right, hey. That probably helps. Okay. Again. You might have written this down earlier. If you did, more power to you. Say that you can't see it. I want to make sure that. Oh yes. Folks, when I visited my brother over the weekend, he and I got to talk about these stained glass windows. And something I said before about this glass flowing, they now think that the way they made the stained glass, was they made it in such a way that one side was heavier than the other, but they put the heavy side downward. So we aren't sure that glass flows or doesn't flow. That's not as much of an issue as we thought it was. I mean, it's not as much of a closed issue as we thought it was. That they may have originally been weighted with the bottom heavier than the top. All right. Remember this about the intellectual revival, universities. First one is at Bologna, Italy. All right. I'm just curious. All right, I'm going to ask this backwards. This Pope I'm talking about, who is he? Who started the Inquisition, killed more than other people, more of him and his successors, who began the sale of indulgences? Who is the Pope I'm talking about here? Most powerful of all popes. Pope Innocent III. He's the one who told the kings what to do, and him and his immediate successors were really powerful. But then ultimately, all it took was one day was some king, and the king who stood up to them was Philip the Fair, and their power, their secular power, waned.